You are ready for the meeting to start.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the City of St. Helena Special City Council meeting Thursday, July 16th, 2020. I have a special paragraph to read regarding remote meetings. In accordance with Executive Orders N-25-20, N-29-20, and guidance from the California Department of Public Health on gatherings, remote public participation is allowed. We will address the order in the following ways. Members of the public may not physically attend meetings. The City Council meeting will be live streamed on Comcast Channel 28 and on the city's website, barring technical difficulties. Those members of the public wishing to participate must do so remotely via Zoom electronic meetings in the following ways. By either onto the Zoom link located on the meeting agenda. Please download the app to your computer or mobile device and enter the meeting ID, or by calling a listed number and enter the meeting ID. Public comment for City Council meetings will be accepted via email to publiccomment@cityofsthelena.org. All public comments will be made publicly available and attached to the agenda item and will not be read out loud. All public comments that are received after 4 p.m. will be attached to the agenda the following day. Please see the end of the agenda for detailed public participation instructions. Priya, is there any additional information on public participation?
Sure, yes, thank you, Mayor Ellsworth. I just wanted to remind everyone that there are a few ways to participate. For those of you who are using Zoom, you can either call in just using a telephone, or you can join using the link and the Zoom app. I'm going to read the number to call and the meeting ID just so that everyone has it. So the number to call is 669-900-6833. And the meeting ID for this meeting is 815-2260-3539. I'll read that again. That's 815-2260-3539. And that's for folks who are using the phone. And during public comment, when the mayor calls for public comment, there are a few ways to give your feedback. So you'll need to use the raise hand feature. If you're using the Zoom app on an iPad, it's at the top of the screen. It looks like a little hand. And at the bottom of the screen, if you're using a computer, is where the hand is located. If you're calling in just using a telephone, you'll press *9, and that will raise the hand. And I will be monitoring that during public comment. And I just wanted to say that if anyone has any questions about how to use Zoom app or anything, you can feel free to reach out to the public comment email or myself, Priya Nixon, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll do the roll call, please.
Mayor Ellsworth?
Here.
Vice Mayor Doring?
Here.
Councilmember Koberstein?
Here.
Knudsen?
Present.
Shuto?
Here.
Very good. And now we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. If everybody would mute your microphone, you can remain seated, place your hand on your heart and follow with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Now, this is a special meeting, and so public comment will come with the item as we get into the item. So we will not have public comment at the beginning here. And so we're going to move now into our item, which is item 4.1. This is new business. This is a community update on status and updates regarding City of St. Helena police use of force policies. I just have a brief statement to read, and then I'll hand it over to Chief Hartley. But we want to recognize the significance of the dialogue happening around the country regarding police policy and procedure and related laws. We welcome that dialogue here. And I also want to express gratitude and support for our local police department for all they do in helping maintain stability in our community, both on a day-to-day basis and along with the fire department as the backbone of our emergency services and our ability to respond in any emergency situation where these women and men are the first ones in and help our community manage any situation we we come up against. So I want to express gratitude to our department, and we're pleased to have you here, Chief, to talk through these issues with us. And with that, we'll also, as the meeting continues, look for opportunity to continue our discussions on social equity, racial equity, that can sort of tie in at some point here. But we want to begin with Chief Hartley talking about our police policies, procedures, et cetera. So if I may hand it over to you, Chief.
Well, thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and council members for the opportunity to speak to everybody tonight. As your Chief of Police representing all St. Helena police officers, I have expressed our outrage and sorrow regarding the actions and inactions of those Minneapolis Police Department officers that led to the death of George Floyd. In light of this incident and others, all segments of our society have inquired about policies that limit the police use of force. I have worked with our mayor and city council to build an understanding of our officers' current training and use of force policies. I'm here tonight to share that information with the community and to address any concerns in regards to police department training and current use of force policies. Bienvenido a mi reunión. La traducción está disponible para cualquier pregunta que puede tener. El oficial de policía, Carlos López, está aquí esta noche para ayudar con cualquier traducción. La versión en español de esta presentación es parte de la agenda de esta noche. Si tiene preguntas que desea hacerme más tarde, llámame o envíeme un correo electrónico directamente. Mil gracias. Go ahead and flip or put up the presentation, Cindy. Next page. Next page. The first thing I want to discuss tonight is officer-related training in regards to the use of force. Firearms, state required annually. SHPD requires it quarterly. Every quarter, our officers are challenged with a different type of range training, different scenarios, so on and so forth. We don't want anybody getting into a situation where they are reacting based on only one style. Our less lethal weapons, which is our taser, OC spray or batons, OC is also referred to as pepper spray, is state required biannual training. St. Helena Police Department is the same. De-escalation training, the state does not require this training yet. However, we sent all of our officers this year through de-escalation training. And to make a long story short, de-escalating training is learning how to take a situation and reduce that situation and calm things down prior to just going in there and reacting to what's immediately at hand. Critical incident training, which is training for when dealing with mentally disabled. The state does not require this training as well. However, we sent all of our officers in 2019. Use of force. The state requires annual review. St. Helena PD does annual training. LGBTQ training is not required by the state of California. However, St. Helena PD has scheduled all of our officers to go through it in 2021. Racial bias training. The state requires biannual training. St. Helena PD sent everybody this past July, last month, or at the beginning of this month. Defensive tactics, state required biannual training. St. Helena Police Departments train annually at a minimum. Some of the bullet points in regards, I wasn't ready to change yet, but some of the bullet points regarding our policy and procedure. Use of force complaints between 2005 and 2020. Use of force, by definition, is the application of physical techniques or tactics, chemical agents, or weapons to another person. It is not a use of force when a person allows himself, herself to be searched, escorted, handcuffed, or restrained. The use of force was not reportable prior to 2017. Since 2017, there's been 0 complaints of this department for excessive force. Prior to 2017, use of force complaints required an internal affairs or IA investigation. Between 2005 and 2020, there's 1 use of force complaint which was investigated in 2006. That case was determined as unfounded. Internal affairs investigations only remain in a personnel file for 5 years. That is probably going to change. However, the only reason I am aware of the 2006 investigation is because I've been here for 21 years and I was the investigating officer. Policy information. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Cindy. The St. Helena Police Department, like many California public safety agencies, contracts our policy manual through Lexipol. Lexipol is a privately owned company which was founded and managed by California attorneys. Lexipol has served first responders and local government officials for over 2 decades. Lexipol policies are based on both federal and state law, current legislation, and state mandates. The policies are ever-changing and updated regularly. This is a living document which can be viewed on the City of St. Helena website. I received a couple of emails in regards to policy. Policies are used as guidelines and cannot be forced. That's not necessarily true. Policies come from both state law and federal law, and they're mandates. They're not guidelines. Pertinent case law affecting use of force policies. I threw these down there in case anybody was interested to see where some of our policy comes from. But real quickly, California Assembly Bill 392, which is the most recent one on here, directly reflects our current application of deadly force, which is the strictest in the nation, and it became effective in January of this year. What it did is it changed reasonable force into necessary force. The old method, or the necessary force, was based on what the officer perceived or believed at the time of the offense. Necessary force, an officer has to prove beyond a reasonable standard that it was necessary to use the force which was used. Graham versus Connor, this is the essential use of force rubric for the country. Placus versus Drinsky, no constitutional duty to use less force when deadly force is authorized. Back when I first came into law enforcement, our use of force policies were based on progressing from one phase to the next phase. You couldn't just automatically go from a baton to a gun, or from pepper spray. You had to go through the correct, at the time, steps. Well, a lot of people were, a lot of fatalities occurred because of that method. When somebody pulls out a weapon or a gun on an officer has to react. He can't react with pepper spray. He can't react with a baton. He has to meet force with force. That's Graham versus Connor. Placus versus Drinsky. That's Placus versus Drinsky. Elliott versus Levitt addresses 2020 hindsight on officer shooting. City of Canton versus Harris addresses liability and failure to train. This is one of the reasons training is the last thing I will ever look at when having to minimize the budget. Training is essential, and it also is a huge liability issue for the city. If I put people out there on the street to deal with situations that have not been trained in those situations, then nothing good can come out of that. The 8 can't wait, that is a current topic in the media that came out on June 3rd of 2020. Former President Obama called on mayors to take the pledge to address police use of force policies in their cities. This can be found on the obama.org website. St. Helena Mayor Jeff Ellsworth and Vice Mayor Paul Doring have both signed President Obama's commitment to action on police use of force. President Obama's website lists 8 points surrounding police use of force policies that are drawn from the Police Use of Force Project and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The St. Helena Police Department incorporates aspects from all of the listed suggestions. We have worked with the City Council in updating policy to further enhance its effectiveness. What we saw, and I briefly want to touch on what we saw back east in Minneapolis, our citizens need to be aware that California is at the tip of the spear in leading the rest of the country when it comes to use of force and in policing in general. There are a lot of states, unfortunately, that are way behind, and there are officers out there that are conducting themselves as officers would 30 or 40 years ago. That's, we can't control, but obviously we do pay the price for whatever officers do. The first one, failing to require officers to de-escalate situations where possible through communication, maintaining distance, slowing things down, and otherwise eliminating the need for force. The St. Helena Police Department requires de-escalation in multiple policy locations. All of our officers are trained in a nationally recognized de-escalation process created in conjunction with the Police Executive Research Forum, known as Integrating Communication, Assessment, and Tactics. All of our officers are trained in crisis intervention training. This training is a law enforcement and mental health collaborative program designed to help officers when dealing with individuals in crisis. Number 2 is prohibiting officers from using maneuvers that cut off oxygen or blood flow, including chokeholds or carotid restraints, which often result in unnecessary death or serious injury. I want the community to know this has been discussed between myself, the mayor, the vice mayor, and all council members. In our policy, the carotid restraint remains. We are deleting that from the policy and taking it out. Currently, the policy requires that an officer must be trained in this technique. And currently, none of our officers have been trained in this technique. Chokeholds have never been part of this policy and never will be. Number 3, failing to require officers to intervene and stop excessive or unnecessary force used by other officers and report these incidents immediately to a supervisor. Per our policy, which again is a mandate, St. Helena Police Department officers observing another officer using force that is clearly beyond that which is objectively reasonable shall intercede to prevent the reasonable use of force and promptly report these observations to a supervisor. The incident I discussed earlier about the use of force complaint that I investigated in 2006 was a direct reflection of not a citizen complaint against an officer. It was an officer complaint against an officer. This has been on our policy for a long time and it remains, and it was highly regarded. Number 4, failing to restrict officers from shooting at moving vehicles, which is regarded as a particularly dangerous and an ineffective tactic. St. Helena Police Department restricts officers from shooting at moving vehicles. Policy relates that officers should move out of the path of an approaching vehicle and only discharge a firearm at a moving vehicle or its occupants when there are no other reasonable means available to avert the threat of the vehicle, or if deadly force other than the vehicle is directed at officers or others. In other words, the only time that we would shoot at a moving vehicle is if we could not get out of the way or to prevent a vehicle from being used as a weapon against a civilian. Number 5, failing to limit the types of force and or weapons that can be used to respond to specific types of resistance and specific characteristics such as age, size, or disability. St. Helena policy requires officers to take specific factors into consideration when potentially using reasonable force. These factors include the individual's age, size, relative strength, apparent mental state or capacity, the influence of drugs or alcohol, the individual's apparent ability to understand and comply with commands, and other factors. Number 6, failing to require officers to exhaust all other reasonable means before resorting to deadly force. Our policy reflects that the department recognizes and respects the value of all human life and dignity without prejudice to anyone. Policy relates that if an objectively reasonable officer would consider it safe and feasible to do so under the totality of the circumstances, officers should evaluate the use of other reasonable available resources and techniques when determining whether to use deadly force. Number 8, failure to require officers to report each time they use force or threaten to use force. Per St. Helena Police Department policy, force is used anytime force is used by another member of the department, they shall promptly, completely, and accurately document that use of force in a report. Per St. Helena policy, anytime an officer points a firearm at any person, that incident shall be documented. The Department of Justice in 2017 has required all reports of use of force, and those reports are subject to public records request. The St. Helena Police Department is committed to serving our community with honor, dignity, fairness, and respect. The St. Helena Police Department utilizes the online flexible policy system to ensure policy is up to date, consistently reviewed, and incorporates the most contemporary standards and best practices. This concludes my presentation, but I would like to address the questions, if I may, that I received over the last couple of weeks via email.
Chief Hartley?
Yes.
May I just step in for a moment? Thank you very much for that report, and I want to circle back to the questions, but I may have been a little remiss at the beginning of the meeting not to check in with the other council members to see if there were any sort of general statements that any of the other council members wanted to make as we get into this discussion. That can wait if everybody's okay, but if anybody had anything that they wanted to introduce at this point, please put a hand up and let me know. Okay, so very good. So Chief, yes, if you would proceed at this point, that'd be very good. Thank you.
Yes, out of respect for the people that, responded with questions and they've been waiting for answers for a week or so, I'd really like to address those before we open things up.
Very good.
I'm not going to give out their last names out of respect and privacy, but these are Vanessa's questions, and they're very interesting questions. These questions are surrounding the blue wall of silence. I've been in this business for 21 years, and I'm reluctant to admit I'd never heard that term. I looked it up on the internet. I asked other officers. I know what it is now and where it comes from. It's a big city term of where officers cover up crimes by other officers by a sworn oath between those officers or beat partners to not divulge that information and not to go forward with it. I can assure you that has never happened here, not under my watch, and not when I was an officer. Some of these things, it really hits at the heart to think that there are people in our profession that will do these things. Every profession that I know of has their 10%, and those 10%ers can make the rest of us look evil. Some cities and states across America are addressing the blue wall of silence by implementing duty to intervene laws that allow for civil suits against officers who do not intervene or do not file a report when witnessing police misconduct, such as excessive use of force or civil rights violations. Excessive use of force can be punished under Penal Code Section 242, which is assault and battery, or 245. A police officer and found guilty of utilizing excessive force is will be prosecuted no differently than a civilian would. Another question, and not only that, let me go back to that real quick. Excessive use of force is also a civil rights violation, which is a violation of federal law. The next question are there any state or local laws, not internal police policies, that currently exist or are in the works that require officers to intervene or file a report when they witness police misconduct by fellow officers? No, not currently, but if caught, can be charged as an accomplice to any crime committed by the other officer or that officer himself. I'm asking specifically about laws rather than internal policies. It is my understanding that internal policies are not legal binding and do not offer resources for civilians who are the victims of police misconduct. Policies are legal binding. They are based on both federal and state law. When a police officer signs on to be a police officer, they swear an oath to the country, to the state, and to the city. We're held accountable to these policies by state law, federal law, the city manager, city council, and myself. As far as resources for civilians who are victims of police misconduct, a victim of police misconduct needs to file a complaint against that department. By law, I am bound to conduct an investigation on any alleged misconduct or any personnel complaint. Does such law exist? If such law does not exist in St. Helena, are you, Chief Hartley, as well as the members of the City Council, open to the creation of such law? That is a discussion that we should probably have. Policies ensure law enforcement agencies comply with laws, industry standards, and case law. They promote accountability, which helps police departments build trust in the community we serve. Thank you for your questions, Vanessa. These questions were posed by Luke. Luke's first question, since the provision and policy manual are considered guidelines and not contractually binding, how can we know that officers will be held accountable for violation of policies? Again, these are not guidelines, these are mandates, and they are binding. We have numerous ways to check on our officers, and our supervisors do that. We all are required to wear body cameras whenever we're outside of this building. Any contact with a civilian or another officer outside of this building, your body camera will be on. Those body camera videos can be reviewed by supervisors, which they do on a regular basis, whether there's an incident or not, as a security blanket to make sure our officers are doing the right thing. Ever since but body cameras have been utilized throughout the country, police misconduct has gone way down. Next question, will you prohibit the use of the carotid control hold in your policy? Yes, we've all agreed to remove that from our policy. The use of force can be traumatizing to an individual, whether or not it is deemed justified by policy. I understand the use of force review board convenes when the use of force by an officer results in very serious injury or death. Would it not be reasonable to ask that the board convenes in response to every use of force by St. Helena officers? St. Helena officers, anytime we touch a person, if we have to escort somebody out of a bar, that is considered a use of force. And if we were to write paper or document every time that we had a use of force, we would not be able to effectively do our jobs. How often do officers find themselves using force in our community? That very, very rarely. We're very fortunate to work in such a place. We have had encounters where we've had to use force. I've had officers assaulted. I've had officers charged with knives. I've had officers hit over the head with crowbars. We've even had officers have guns pulled on them. So even though we're in a small town, it's very rare that any of those happen. But this is California, and we have great citizens, but there are also bad people out there. There's also mentally ill people that we deal with that can be challenging at times. Of the use of this review board, 4 or 5 members seem to be from within the department. How do you protect from bias when examining your own department? If it's a serious offense, that's something that's not in the policy or that the public would normally know about, we are in a contract with the Major Crimes Task Force with the county. Anytime there is a serious injury or a result of death anywhere in the county, the Major Crimes Task Force is summoned. The Major Crimes Task Force is made up of county officials as well as police officers from every or police investigators from every jurisdiction within the county. The Use of Force Review Board that you find in our policy is in conjunction with any other investigation. The Use of Force Review Board is not convened unless there's a major incident. And it has no weight or bearing on the determination made by the District Attorney's Office or from the Major Crimes Task Force. Another question was, has the use of annual surveys by the Community Relations Coordinator been informative to the department? What percentage of the community have participated in these surveys? We live in a small community. We have continual contact with the community. We have an open door policy, and we have an unparalleled reputation with the community. We do not have a community relations coordinator, and we have not in the past solicited any type of survey. The next question, many police departments have reported members feeling overstretched in their duties. Are there other departments or organizations in the city that you wish were better equipped to handle some of the many jobs expected of the St. Helena Police Department? I'll be quite honest with this one. I couldn't work in a better city. Every department we have here is extremely responsive, and we have open and great relationships. If anything were to change, it would have to be something statewide, and that results or comes from the defunding of the mental health program back when Ronald Reagan was our governor. It was defunded to a point that it has never been restabilized, and you hear defunding of police departments. It's not really a defunding, it's a diversion of police department funds to the mental health system as a way to get mental health professionals to take some of the calls that we take. And that is another conversation that is just in the beginnings. I have belonged to California Association of Chiefs of Police. This topic has been on the table for the last 2 years. It appears that they have come to an agreement that they're going to present to the governor in the near future, that they want to see put into legislation, as well as defunding, or not defunding, decertifying police officers is another big topic from with Cal Chiefs. They're researching it. Police misconduct, none of us, especially in my position, will tolerate it. Decertifying is not a bad idea. The question was, who would be responsible for on a bad officer? The question's been thrown around, should it be controlled by Department of Justice? Should it be a civilian panel? The consensus through Cal Chiefs is that we do that through POST. California Peace Officer Standards and Training are the agency that certifies us as police officers. They certify us as police departments. If any agency is going to be in charge of the decertification process, that is the agency that we would recommend. And lastly, not lastly, how many members of St. Helena PD speak Spanish? That is a great question. Right now, we're running a little low in our staffing levels, but right now we have 16 total staff. Of the 16, 7 are fluent in Spanish. As far as the racial makeup of the department goes, out of the total 16, 8 are white, 6 are Hispanic, and 1 is Italian. And that is a pretty good correlation of what our community is. Lastly, what will training in bias-based policing continue to look like in this department? That training is constantly evolving and constantly ongoing. And like I mentioned earlier when I was speaking about our training, our officers have all been through it recently, and they will do it annually as things progress. Again, I'd like to thank Luke and Vanessa for their questions ahead of time. And at this point, I'll turn it over to the City Council.
Thank you, Chief. We appreciate that. I'm going to first open it up to the council for comments and questions, and then open it to public comment. Are there any initial comments or questions from council? Okay, seeing none, I will take it to public comment. Priya, are you on the line here to see if there's public comment at this point?
Yes, I am on the line, and I'll remind people that they can click on the raise hand feature. It's at the top of the screen on an iPad and at the bottom from a computer. And I did just see someone raise their hand, and then the hand went away. So I'm looking again. Okay, perfect. So we do have public comment here. Let me unmute this person. 1 second. All right. You should be able to speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Vanessa. I asked the question, one of the questions, and thank you so much for answering it. So many thoughts, but I really appreciate that the conversation is happening. And I guess my question is, and please forgive my ignorance, I don't know all the laws surrounding this, but in the case of, in so many cases of police brutality, it seems like it takes a long time for officers to be arrested. And if internal policies are supposed to protect citizens, why is that? Yeah, basically that's my question. Why is that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I was waiting for council to either answer or have me answer that question.
Chief, please, Chief, take that question.
Thank you for your question, Vanessa. Like I said, I've been in this business for quite a while. I have not had to deal with such a situation, so that, you know, I really can't answer that question. I know the district attorney very well in this county, and she won't tolerate officer misconduct in the least, and she would not hesitate in filing charges if that were the case.
So it's you're saying it's up to individual departments, or I guess I don't follow.
It's up to the local district attorney.
Okay.
If a crime has been committed by an officer, it is investigated. Initial investigation is started by the agency. As soon as we realize that it's actually a bifurcated investigation. Mm-hmm. If it's an alleged crime, there's an administrative investigator that investigates policy. If there's a crime that's been occurred, then there is also a criminal investigation happening at the same time. The two investigators cannot share information back and forth. So in a case of police misconduct or alleged police brutality, the district attorney would handle the criminal case. The police department would handle the administrative part.
Right.
That makes sense to you. And I don't know. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it does, but I mean, I think people are upset and protesting, and this is not about the St. Helena Police Department, obviously, but people are upset because it doesn't seem to be working. And so what needs to change? We have you now, but who's to, yeah, it's just, it seems like we need stronger laws to keep everyone accountable. And I'm wondering what those laws should be, because it just doesn't seem to be working.
No, I completely understand, and I agree with you. Like I said, we're fortunate to live where we live, and thank goodness that those issues don't occur in this community, but it's a lot bigger picture than that.
Yeah.
You know, and our voices do need to be heard, and changes do need to be made.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Are there any additional questions from the public?
Yes, we do have additional public comment. Let me unmute this person. One moment.
And so I'll just remind folks. And I'll just remind folks that if you take 4 minutes to pose the questions, and then the chief can answer the questions after they're brought forward. Thank you.
Perfect.
Beth, can you hear me?
Yes. I lost the screen, but the question is just, with this new thinking about redesigning, reimagining police departments, and you had alluded earlier to, the Reagan era when there was a lot of mental illness following the closing down of institutions. Is that something the St. Helena Police Department would like to look into, to say, how can we work with, maybe social workers or psychologists or whatever, who maybe could be on an on-call basis or something like that, so they can deal with mental illness, which is their forte anyway. Is that part of the discussion that we're having right now, or you're having, or thinking about?
That is definitely part of thank you for your question, but that is definitely one of the points that I made earlier. That is not something that the city could afford to do by themselves. It is something that needs to happen with county mental health, and it's something that probably every city within the county or municipality would need to budget for. Also, the training from the mental health perspective, if we quit, for instance, we're going to find out real quick, it sounds like Los Angeles Police Department is no longer going to be responding to mental health calls like 5150s or persons under the influence of narcotics. If you send people into, civilians into these situations, and they end up in a violent situation that they're not prepared for or not trained for, that's unfortunately an accident waiting to happen. So what we need to do is get more training for the mental health people. Mental health needs to hire more people in order to be effective.
Right, and maybe even starting out like a team approach. So it'd be an officer and a mental health person or something like that.
Correct, working together.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. And countywide, that really makes sense, because how often do you need it? You don't want a full-time person just waiting around. So there's being creative of how could we use it countywide, but making sure, time-wise too, that if something's happening up Valley, we got to have somebody there within 10 minutes kind of thing, So
Correct.
Thank you. Yeah.
One of the opportunities we have in Napa County is this cross-jurisdictional dialogue, tying our municipalities and our county together and working with partners in the nonprofit world specifically in the health and mental health areas. Our small cities don't all have the capacity, the efficiencies of scale, but working together with the other jurisdictions, we can create that. And there are opportunities where we can tie in and perhaps see how we can move these partnerships forward. Priya, is there additional?
Yes, there is additional public comment. Let me unmute this person. Okay, you should be able to speak.
Unmute myself.
Preston?
Hi there. This is Holly Hubbard Preston. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Chief Hartley, thanks very much for spearheading this and reaching out to the public. I really appreciate it as a citizen and also a journalist. I have a question. You mentioned earlier that you don't have a community relations coordinator. I think that Luke had asked you a question about a community survey. And I wondered if you would be willing, maybe with the city council, to actually make available a survey so that the public, portions of the public that may not be represented in this discussion, who, you know, may know that policies exist, but, you know, wouldn't know how to file a complaint, you know, are still outside of that. And I think what we're seeing in the national theater right now playing out is that there are a lot of people who feel disenfranchised, disempowered by the system. So you're would be opening up the system and opening up that communication. I'm wondering if you're willing to do that, to do a survey that maybe people could pick up, perhaps not at the police station to maintain their anonymity, but maybe the public library. I mean, it's difficult with COVID, but I'm wondering what you think about that or if you've considered that.
Absolutely. We've considered it, and I would be more than happy to do that. Prior to that going out, the public should know that we have a private email address that only myself and council members have access to. It's shpd@cityofsthelena.org. And again, any email that comes to me via that email is also viewed by City Council.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that I did read some of Luke's comments online, and I know from other people that I've spoken to in the community, I think there is some disconnect. I think that, you know, we appreciate our police department, but there is a kind of a disconnect in communication. So I hope you'll consider that survey. Thank you.
Thank you. And certainly the effort is to bridge that disconnect so that we all start feeling that the lines of communication and the efforts are the best that they can be. So tools such as surveys, whatever tools we can find to make what we have even better. I think that's what we're here for. That's what we want to hear about and design some strategies and tactics to move these ideas forward. Ms. Chateau.
I just wanted to say, I think that a survey is a great idea. And I had a conversation with our city manager, Presswitch, about it earlier, about how important it would be to have it be in Spanish and that we're reaching out to our Latinx community. Because when I think about race and justice and equality, I think it's really the Latinx community. It's everybody, but I also want to focus on that in St. Helena and make sure that we are hearing their voice, and we don't always get a lot of participation through our council meetings. And I think it's so important to have trusted partners, as Holly mentioned, whether it's the library or we have Up Valley, and just make sure that we're partnering with people so that they know that they can trust us and that we want to do good with the information and we want to make real changes. And also, Chief Hartley, thank you, and my fellow council, Mayor, Vice Mayor, for being willing to get rid of the carotid artery. That's so great that we're able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional public comment at this point? Priya, are we seeing any hands come up?
I'm looking right now to see if there's additional public comment to speak. Again, you can use that raise hand feature. It's at the top of the screen or the bottom of the screen. And I'm not seeing any raised hands right now.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to bring it back to the council. Thank you, Ms. Chateau, for your comments. Are there any other council comments or questions at this point? Vice Mayor Doring?
Well, first of all, thank you for all the contributors to the dialogue who took the time today to zoom in and share your opinions. They're extremely valuable. The notion of the survey, I think, is very valuable. The questions that were asked and answered are extremely valuable for our decision-making process. I wanted to note that we started this process before the murder of George Floyd. That certainly added urgency to our discussion. There's no doubt about it, as well as a number of other cases that have happened throughout the country. But the council decided that we wanted a review of our policies back in March. And so this is, I very much thank the chief and staff for moving this forward and for your presentation and for your service to our community. I would like to have the dialogue continue on and not have this as a one-stop, end of story, and we move on. I think it's important that we review our policies, a couple times a year. Let's Suppose a great organization. They provide a valuable service, but it is there's a bias in it in terms of how it's presented. And so we have an obligation to make sure that the policies that are developed, first of all, are consistent with the law. And they are generally, because this is an organization that is staffed with attorneys. But we also have to make sure that those policies are aligned with our little community, our community's values. And so we have to check in a lot on that to make sure, as we're doing right now. So I commend the chief for doing that. I obviously commend the chief for the commitment to eliminate in its entirety the carotid restraint mechanism, because I think that's its time has long passed. I would like going forward to look at other policies, Chief, that we have in more detail. You touched upon a few. I would like to have a better understanding specifically of body cameras, not now, but maybe separately at a later time. The details about body cameras, the storage and retention of videos, sort of the circumstances where they are turned off and on. I get the general policy, but I think we need to drill down a little bit in that policy. The use of tasers, I'd like to have a longer discussion about that. The thing that I hear a lot, and maybe not so much here locally, many of these issues are throughout our country and not locally. So in a way, I kind of feel it's kind of strange to talk about these issues, but it's important to talk about these issues. Another thing is just the basic return of someone's personal property when they're detained and brought in, and cell phones and things like that, wallets, watches, those things occasionally go missing. Not saying that happens in our department, but I know a lot of departments have a policy on, how long it should take to get someone's property back to them, because that goes to the dignity of a person. Your cell phone disappears and you never find it again. That's obviously not right, and so we should focus on that. I'm extremely concerned about the use of the word disability in this context. We have folks in our community where if you look at a person, you could not necessarily tell that they had a disability. So we need to focus in on that and keep up that training. Folks with certain conditions, it's not readily apparent that they may have a disability. And I know that there's a lot of training around that, but to me, that has been brought to my attention by some citizens in our community who worry that, there may be a person who may look 30 years old, but, they have maybe the mind of a 13-year-old or 14-year-old, and you couldn't necessarily tell that right away. And we really need to understand that, because it's so important. We don't want to hurt somebody who's doesn't have the ability to understand what is going on. And I know that you train on that a lot, but we need to focus on that. I would like to see some bias training in our city, not only of the police department, but our city and citizens. Frankly, the things that are happening in the police department are a reflection of what happens in society. Microaggressions, bias, we all have to come to grips with that because we're all subject to it. We first have to admit that we're all subject to it. Microaggressions especially. And I could go back to seeing, I was raised by a Mexican grandmother, and she would take us around town and people didn't think I was her grandchild. And that still to this day hurts me. That's an example of a microaggression that has stuck with me my entire life, where someone thought that was my nanny, and that was my grandmother. So we're all subject to those little microaggressions, and over time, the cumulative impact of those is devastating. I agree with Councilmember Chateau that we need to focus in on our community and get things in Spanish, focus on our Latinx community, but also our LGBTQ community. We don't want to leave anyone out in the dialogue. So we should open that up. I have a question for you, Chief. This is about how the de-escalation policy works. And I kind of know the answer, but let's assume that there's a situation where there is an escalation and it gets a little out of hand, and say maybe a suspect is running away, and then they're captured and everybody's sort of amped up at that point, right? Both the suspect and the officer. Is there an obligation for the officer to then recheck and go through the same de-escalation process? In other words, in general, is the officer required to continually go through a check and go through the sort of training that they have, or is it just one stop and now we're free to do what we want? I mean, that bothers me, because you see these images online where somebody's running away and they get shot in the back. It's like, well, okay. I just would like to have your response on that, because, obviously that's not a concern here, but it is a concern. I don't understand that part of law enforcement. I know I've taken a lot of time and I've given a lot of ideas, but I'll stop now.
I'd like to answer that question as thoroughly as possible, but as short as possible. The de-escalation training is something that is ever changing. We remember watching on the show Cops, where there's a car pursuit and there's 3 or 4 cars. The guy's already detained, and the officers from the other cars continue to pile on. With the responsibility lies on every officer on the scene, and every officer knows that now. They're taught from the academy. That's probably started 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and it is in-service training as well, which is why we do it annually. But to when you see something, you say something. If you see somebody that's all amped up, you calm that person down, not just the suspect, but the officer as well. Once control has been obtained, everything stops. And one thing we preach to our officers, time is always on our side. The recent one where the gentleman was shot in the back, that was not a very good example, because we didn't get to see the whole footage of that video. He'd actually turned and shot the taser at the officer. But there is incidents where that's happened over something. You get into a pursuit because the guy has a misdemeanor warrant. Guys are not going to chase somebody because of a misdemeanor warrant. If you have a felony nonviolent warrant and you get into a foot pursuit or a car pursuit and things are getting dangerous, they're taught to terminate that. You can always get them later, as long as they're not a threat to the community. But that's our way of thinking, and I hope that helps briefly answer your question.
Well, I appreciate those comments. It's reassuring to know that is part of the culture of our department. It should be the culture of all departments, and a constant recheck of your situation, and knowing that other officers are also required to sort of de-escalate the entire situation, including themselves, as things move forward in a pursuit. So thank you very much, Chief. I appreciate your service, and I appreciate the fact that you're so willing to have this dialogue with our community. It's important to have this dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Ms. Koberstein?
Yeah, I want to thank the chief and also Officer Lopez for being with us this evening and your response to the questions that came in from the community. I want to thank Paul Doring. Policing and our policies are an issue that he has raised consistently over the years, and I'm glad to see that we are having this session. I think we, going forward, need to do more to get this information out to the community. I have no idea how many people are possibly listening to us this evening, but more visits to the newspaper, information through Shine, other ways, I think, for people to understand what our police department is doing. One thing I think we could improve on is just the police report. It's really just bare bones statistics of how many calls for this or that. And I think it could be more humanized as to what is happening with policing in our city. What are you called on to do? How do you respond? Sort of create more of a dialogue with the community. I agree with Anna about the survey and that we need to look to see if there's bias. I think we should do that. I think it's another way of getting more information. Going forward, I'd like to, we heard about the mental health options a little bit this evening, but I hope we can think about it more. Other options where the police are intervening in various sectors of our community, like how do you operate in the schools, for instance, and what happens there, just as an informative message to the community. And your perhaps analysis of whether there's another opportunity to work with partners and de-escalate the situation, or whether it's not possible under the circumstances. But I think this was an important conversation, and I thank you for putting it together. It's very thorough. Thanks.
Thank you. Other Mr. Knudsen?
Hi, thanks very much, Chief and Chief Hartley, and also City Manager Presswich, and the Mayor and Council for all your for putting this together, and also your great comments. And thank you for the change in policy around the pressure to the neck, which we're not trained on and can't use and shouldn't use. I also want to commend the Chief and our police department on the emphasis on training, because I think that's a big part of it. I also want to thank the community members that reached out to me directly, and we are happy to be a further conduit to your police department. And also, I really appreciate the spirit of openness and directness that is displayed in this meeting, and I think is also a hallmark of our interaction with our police department. I'd also like to suggest that one of the ways, which I've mentioned before in public meeting, but I'll mention again, is one of the ways to sort of erase the divide between our public safety officers and the public is to get the police actually out of vehicles as much as possible and onto the street, whether it be through pedestrian or through bicycle. And I would encourage the city council and the chief and city manager to think about ways that we could help to erase that barrier so that people see officers on their level instead of simply behind a car. And I know that's not possible all the time. Certainly in many of the times that we have officers available, they actually need to either be back at the station or behind a patrol car for speed and whatnot, but I'd like to also just see the presence around town in more informal settings, and it's sort of an informal way if that's possible. Thanks very much, everyone, and thank you to the community for participating.
Thank you. Are there additional comments, Ms. Chateau?
I just wanted to say one more quick thing. What I wanted to say is that I too was so grateful for all the training that we have been doing. When you went through the list, and there were so many times you said that we weren't obligated to do it, but we did do it. I was very proud of that for St. Helena, and I also want you to please bring to us any other training if there's any way that we can support the police department in providing more funding to do more training. I want to be supportive of that personally. And I want us to think about how can we promote the idea of being anti-racist, which takes it one step further to acknowledging that we all have bias, and then how do we become a city that actively is opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance, and that we're known for that.
Thank you. Those are wonderful comments. I have a few more comments. A question for the chief. I got a letter that had an interesting thought in terms of programming at Napa Valley College, and they have a police and criminal justice program. Is there some opportunity for partnership there? Sort of my thought is that if we are and can create a model program where we are promoting sort of a more just community, promoting nonviolence, and having our police officers and our peace officers being an integral part of that, is there some partnership available with something like Napa Valley College so that the model that we're creating can sort of be passed on and become sort of a system of a different way of thinking, sort of a way of thinking that's progressing, having policing progress into a new era. Is there some opportunity for partnership there with the college?
Well, Mayor, there is a partnership there. I was actually one of their drill instructors there for a few years. I meet with them frequently, and anything that we would want to promote through their public safety training center would have to be certified by post. So our thoughts and ideas that we come up with, whether it be on racially biased training or things, there's always room for improvement in all these areas. I have no problem going forward and implementing our thoughts and ideas with the college, and they're very receptive to hearing that, and they can make the changes. And even our training manager here within the police department can develop those and get post-approval, not only for in-service training, but also possibly into the academy setting.
Thank you. I mean, for me to see that we can maybe use this as a way to foster a new generation as well, coming up in a new way of thinking or an evolving way of thinking, that's a great opportunity, I think. And looking at it already existing partnerships that we can continue to build. Are there any other thoughts at this point as we move forward here? I think our next steps are creating a meeting looking at our social justice, racial equity, social equity. That the hope is that's sort of the next step of this, that we want our council, our community, our police department involved in how we can continue fostering a more just, a more peaceful future for not just St. Helena, but our county, our state, and our country. So the next step, I believe, is sort of processing what we've learned tonight and talked about, and then creating a follow-up meeting, talking about how we do that and what that meeting contains in the not too distant future. So if that feels like a good next step from the council, that to me would be where we would want to go after this meeting. Any thoughts on that? Okay. So what we'll do is we'll close the meeting, we'll adjourn the meeting, and then look at when we can schedule and talk about a time for a subsequent meeting, looking at the the racial equity, social equity, and how it ties into our policy and procedure in St. Helena. If that sounds good with everybody. If there's, Ms. Chateau?
Sounds great. Definitely want to have another meeting and move forward on this topic.
Very good. So if that's everything, if everybody, Chief, any final words before we move forward here, move to adjournment?
I just really want to thank everybody for assisting in making this meeting happen. It is very long overdue, and I look forward to our next conversations and our follow-up meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Officer Lopez, as well. Thank you, staff and council, and we will circle back and with our next steps. And thank you to the community for being here tonight. It's very important to us that you're here as well. So with that, I will adjourn the meeting, and we will see you as we go forward. Thank you.